In this first video for the respiratory system, we'll look at the divisions of the respiratory tract and look at the details of the structures that are part of the upper respiratory tract. Looking at the illustration on the right side of the slide, you can clearly make out the area of the head and the two lungs, and between that lies a tube. At the superior end is the larynx, the voice box. The upper respiratory tract is all that lies above and includes the larynx. The lower respiratory tract are those structures that lie below the larynx. You may be familiar with the terms upper or lower respiratory infections. Which one do you think would generally be a more serious issue? Clinically, it is often difficult to distinguish between the two. So here we have the illustration with the structures labeled. I chose this image specifically as it has the larynx to be part of the lower respiratory tract. Please remember that these divisions are man-made. Some scientists or doctors will consider it one way and others the opposite. Generally, I find it mostly divided the way I stated on the previous slide. Taking that into consideration, the nose, nasal cavity, sinuses, pharynx, tonsils, and larynx are a part of the upper respiratory tract. The trachea, bronchial tubes, and lungs are a part of the lower respiratory tract. Dividing the structures also can be considered from a functional perspective that distinguishes between airflow and gas exchange. The conducting zone structures provide a passage for inhaled gases from the nostrils to the bronchioles. The respiratory zone includes the alveolar ducts and alveoli where gas exchange takes place. Okay, so let's look at these structures and their features. This image of the skull should be familiar. I used the color-coded illustration to make it simple to discuss. Look into the nasal cavity. Do you recall the inferior nasal conchae? Those are the two rounded bones that are blue. Just above them, you see the middle nasal conchae colored in green. The superior nasal conchae are not visible. It is important to note that the middle and superior nasal conchae are parts of the ethmoid bone. It'll be helpful to look at the two images on this slide while I discuss the nose and its special features. The lower one is a sagittal view. The lungs would not fare well if the air in the atmosphere was directly distributed to them. The air we inhale is too dry and cool and may contain particles harmful to the lungs. The function of the nose is to warm, moisten, and humidify the air. You may remember that the sense of taste is 80% smell, and smell is perceived by particles or chemicals being picked up by receptors and carried through the olfactory nerve. When your vocal cords in your throat vibrate, the sound resonates within the nasal cavity to help create the richness of the voice. Collectively, the nasal conchae are small bony protrusions covered by a mucous membrane. That mucous membrane is lined by pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium. When you look at the two images on the slide, you can see that the passageway created by the turbinates is not straight, but creating ridges, thus increasing surface area. With the mucous membrane covering the bones, a narrow channel is formed. These are called the meatuses, and there is one associated with each nasal conchae. I've already mentioned the epithelium of the nasal mucosa, and the image on this slide shows that tissue type. The olfactory mucosa is the area on the roof of the nasal cavity that contains odor receptors. When we sniff deeply, the intent is to get those chemicals in the air to this area so we can better pick up the scent. Mucus that is produced by goblet cells is great at trapping particles and also will humidify the incoming air. Mucus gets pushed to the back of the throat because you may remember that the pharynx is a common passageway, and then the particles trapped in the mucus get swallowed versus going into the lungs. In the digestive unit, we discussed how stomach acid plays a role in protecting the body from pathogens. The nasal mucosa also contains these lysozymes, which destroy bacteria. Lastly, the nasal mucosa has a rich blood supply. Think when someone has a bloody nose. There's a lot of blood, right? Blood is warm and helps to humidify the air as it passes through the nasal cavity. Next, I'll quickly review the pharynx that was first mentioned in the digestive unit. Looking at this image, you can see that the pharynx is divided into three areas: the nasopharynx, oropharynx, and laryngopharynx, which is sometimes referred to as the hypopharynx. The pharynx is a hollow tube that begins posterior to the nose, goes down the neck, and terminates at the top of the trachea and esophagus. The larynx is the voice box. There's a flap of elastic cartilage called the epiglottis that covers the opening to the larynx, thereby directing food and water to the esophagus. The glottis consists of the vocal cords and the opening between them. When we breathe, the glottis opens up to let air go into our lungs. But when we talk, the glottis closes and vibrates, making different sounds. The glottis allows for ventilation, phonation, and provides protection to the airway. I do recommend clicking on these links and watching the two videos. If you watch the videos, you'll see the structure in action. On the left, you can see what the larynx looks like when the vocal folds are closed. The other two show them open. These folds vibrate in order for us to make sounds, phonation. If you haven't watched the videos, here's your chance again.